Well, without giving too much away, I am really, really happy with that game. Not a particularly long game, but I was really happy with some of the calculation. There were a lot of tactics at, well, one particular moment, which you'll see if you watch to the end of the video. But yeah, I'm really happy with that. I thought that there were a couple of opportunities where I could have played moves which went towards a more drawish position, but particularly because I'm higher rated than my opponent, I really just wanted to go for it. So when I was playing the game, I actually didn't know that my opponent was so much lower rated than me. I could have maybe found out beforehand, but I didn't want to. I didn't want to do any prep, I just wanted to show up and play the game. So, my opponent opens with pawn c4, and I'm not going to lie, when I saw it was the English, I was kind of just like dying inside because I hate facing the English. But I was like, okay, right, let's go c6. We always play c6. And maybe my opponent plays e4 and we can get an accelerated Panov after d5. But he goes d4 and I go d5 and we enter the Slav defense. So my opponent goes knight c3. I go knight to f6, just jostling for these central squares. And he goes e3, which is not that ambitious of a move, I have to say, but my opponent was blitzing out his moves for a good chunk of the opening, so I felt like he knew what he was doing. So the game continued with e6, going for the Semi-Slav. I know that bishop to f5 is technically the best move, but there's some complicated positions with like queen b3, queen b6, and I'm just not a massive fan of these sorts of lines because I don't know the theory. And also, I didn't want to trade queens early because I felt like, you know, I knew I was higher rated than my opponent. I didn't know he was 1650, but I knew that I should be looking for a win regardless. So instead, I go pawn to e6, the Semi-Slav defense, where this bishop is trapped inside the pawn chain for the time being because it can't come out this way or come out this way. However, at some point, I'm either going to look to play, like, but after the move a3, which is very strange, but let's say something like bishop d3, for example, here I was potentially going to play dc4, bishop c4, b5, bishop back to d3, something like a6, knight f3, and bishop to b7, looking for c5 ideas. You can change the move order up, but that's effectively the plan of the Semi-Slav in this variation. The other way to free the bishop is to look to play e5, which is what I did in this game because my opponent played this a3 move. And the moment I saw this move, I just thought, there is no way you can get away with that. Like, I've never seen this before, and there has to be a reason I've never seen this before. Now, I was initially thinking that perhaps my opponent is trying to prevent me from playing bishop to b4. But I never really want to go bishop b4 anyway, because with him playing e3 so early, this bishop is not coming out this way. It's either going to come to d2 or fianchetto to b2, and if I look to go bishop b4, that justifies the bishop coming to d2, looking for a bishop trade, right? Which I don't want, because I have my central pawns on light squares, so my bishop will sit very pretty on d6, which is exactly where I put the bishop. My opponent continues with knight to f3, which is very standard. And in these lines, as the black pieces, I've basically just got to keep checking, can white play e4, right? That's what I'm doing. I'm also considering, after castles and bishop d3, can I take on c4? And I actually can take on c4. The point is that you wait for the bishop to develop and then you take, because then the bishop wastes a tempo coming to c4, having already gone to e2 or d3 first. And after something like b5, let's say bishop back to d3, knight bd7, I thought that this would be interesting, but I thought that I could also just go knight bd7 immediately, and this capture isn't going anywhere. If c5 is ever played, this is horrific for white, because after bishop back to c7, I'm going to execute e5 because the pressure has been taken off of my d5 pawn, and my bishop's going to open up against this white king very, very nicely. The Slav can be very aggressive, especially the Semi-Slav, which we'll see later on. So we have knight bd7, kind of a waiting move, also adding more support to a potential e5 push. I'm also considering what happens if white plays pawn to e4. And on pawn e4, I had two different ideas. The first one was taking on c4, and after bishop c4 playing pawn e5. But after something like takes, and takes, I'm not really sure that I wanted to play a queenless middle game sort of position. So more than likely, I would have taken on e4, and after something like knight e4, knight e4, bishop e4, I then have e5 in this position. If takes, I can go knight takes. If knight takes, then I actually don't have to take here. I have queen a5 check. But even if I do take and my opponent trades queens with me, this is a much better version of the previous line, namely because my dark squared bishop is so powerful on this diagonal. Let's say castles for white, bishop e6 watching this pawn. The pawn has to push as that's the only way to defend the pawn. And realistically, only black is going to win this game. This bishop is stunted, my bishops are fantastic, and this bishop is stuck playing defense. So, with all of that being said, that's why I was okay with this position, not committing to taking in b5 just yet, because I knew that e4 was manageable. So we have castles, and I break with e5 immediately. The reason I break with e5 is because I was considering rook e8, giving more support to the e5 push. However, after pawn e4, d4, knight e4, knight e4, bishop e4, pawn e5, we enter a very similar line after something like takes, and this is actually quite good for me. But I was partially concerned about white pushing d5 in some certain lines. Now, the engine isn't impressed by this at all. It says knight c5, and I am better with tempo on the bishop, but I would say it's slightly complicated. So I, instead of going rook to e8, decided on the immediate pawn to e5. Now, at this point in the game, I was also ahead on the clock by, I think, about 10-15 minutes. We had an hour and 15 minutes each, no increment, and you get an extra, I think, 15 minutes on move 35. Really interesting time format. But yeah, I'd used like 5 minutes. My opponent had used like 15 minutes. So I was feeling very confident in this position. Now here, white needs to start initiating trades in the center. He has to, because if he doesn't, then I go pawn to e4. Even if he saves the bishop from being forked, I still go pawn e4, and after the knight drops back, we get a very similar position to what I showed before, with the bishops opening up on the king side, and only black is going to win this position. So we have cd5, cd5, and d takes e5. Now here the engine actually prefers to move pawn e4, which is pretty crazy, just completely exploding the center. I actually thought my opponent might consider e4 in this position, but I wasn't sure about how good that was. I have ed4, knight d4, bishop e5 is the strongest move, but I think I'd calculated d4, knight e4, knight e4, bishop e4, and I think rook e8, knight f6 were on my radar, and I just thought that, well, I should be okay here. I actually have bishop h2, king h2, and queen h4 check, picking the bishop back up and being up the h2 pawn, which I didn't see, but I thought that the open center should be good for us. So my opponent, like I said, takes on d5, cd5, and again, white cannot allow pawn e4, so either white plays e4 or he takes, and my opponent chooses to take. So we get an exchange in the center. Here, white either has to go bishop back to e2 or take on e5, because otherwise bishop g4 could be quite annoying, or I could just grab the bishop pair. So he takes on e5, bishop to e5, and here my opponent spent about 25 minutes or something. Really long time. And it's a difficult position for white. It's really difficult because I have this isolated d-pawn, which theoretically should mean that white is better because, well, if he can just turn up the pressure on the d5 pawn, he should be able to win it eventually and just be up a pawn. The problem, though, is this bishop. And that was my thought during the game. I thought, well, that bishop is just so bad. Like, with my bishop on e5, you can't play b3 or b4 to fianchetto because you'll simply hang your knight. And if you play a move like queen c2, trying to preemptively defend the knight, it's viable, but after something like, I don't know, bishop d7 and rook c8, it's still not easy. And I have ideas of d4 at different moments in the game, which we will see later on when there's a big tactical skirmish.
So we have pawn h3, which I thought was a very good move. Some of you may be thinking about the move queen to f3, applying pressure, preparing rook d1. That loses to bishop g4. The queen is literally trapped. She has no squares. Kind of crazy. So my opponent played pawn h3, which I was expecting. But I was having a bit of a dilemma about how to continue my development. I was looking at a few moves. Rook e8 was one move, preparing ideas of knight to e4. Because I thought that in some lines, if I can get this trade, then I have a space advantage and only I can win the position. But I didn't want to initiate trades too early. It does get rid of my isolated pawn as well. So I was considering rook e8. I was also considering bishop to e6 here, which I almost went for. The reason I rejected this is, I think queen f3. I think for some reason I didn't like queen f3. And after something like rook to e8, pawn e4 is a move here. I think pawn e4 was what I was annoyed by, actually. And it's not simple, like bishop c3, bc3, d e4, bishop e4, knight e4, queen e4. And I don't think I actually have any useful discoveries on the queen, because I don't have bishop here. And if I go bishop takes h3, does just queen takes b7. And with opposite colored bishops, I don't see how I'm going to win this position, particularly if this bishop can get to a square like d4. So, because of that, I decided to play bishop to d7. Bishop d7 has a very obvious idea of coming to c6, and my thinking was that, okay, if my opponent goes for e4, then I can simply take on c3, and after he takes back, I can take on e4. And after the bishop moves to, let's say, I don't know, c4, then I can actually start with queen c7. But the long-term goal is to put my bishop on c6, be up a pawn, and I thought this was relatively easy to play. So e4 is stopped, and I have a little bit of time to bring my bishop over to c6. My opponent here goes bishop d2. A very natural move, but a move that I was very happy to see. He played that very, very quickly. Considering he spent a very long time on pawn h3, I blitzed out bishop to c6. And here I was like, okay, I've got 1, 2, 3 defenders on the e4 square. White only has 2 attackers. I can add a third defender with rook to e8. However, after queen c2, rook c8, I'm still stopping any e4 ideas because I simply have de4. And if bishop takes e4, I have bishop takes e4. The queen can't take because the knight defends, and the knight can't take because the queen will hang. So by playing rook c8, I'm indirectly stopping white from playing e4. And why is e4 something that I'm so concerned about? Well, if e4 happens, then this bishop gets out. Very simply. And I didn't really want to meet e4 with d4 if I could avoid it. Now here, it's actually a perfectly legitimate move because the knight will have to move and then I can take on e4 and open up a discovery on the queen. But if that wasn't the case, then it's far less appealing. Like, for example, if e4 is played here and I go d4 for whatever reason, I'm still better. Like, if something like knight to e2, I can win the pawn on e4. But if e4 has sufficient support, it could be kind of annoying to deal with. And this pawn on d4 is kind of nice, but also f4 is concerning, right? Trying to counterattack. So I thought, okay, I'll leave this pawn on d5 as long as I can, and I'll just bring all my pieces in. So rook c8, rook ad1, rook e8. Rook e8 is obviously lending more support to the e4 square. And in this position, my opponent played rook f to e1, although I was very concerned about bishop to f5, attacking my rook, and after rook to c7... To be fair, the engine just wants to bring the bishop back or play rook fe1 anyway. And it's kind of unclear what the point of inducing rook c7 is, because am I not just going to double up? Is that not just helping me? It's kind of unclear, to be honest. So my opponent goes rook fe1, but this is an inaccuracy. This is an inaccuracy, and there is one move in this position that really grabs the advantage for the black pieces. So I would encourage you to pause the video and try to find the move. So the move is what I played relatively quickly. It felt very intuitive. Bishop back to b8. Why is this so strong? Well, firstly, we are stopping pawn to e4 because of de4. And again, after something like bishop to e4, bishop to e4, the knight can never take because the queen hangs, right? So I'm opening up my rook to the defense of e4, so e4 can't be played. More importantly, I'm getting my bishop out of the center, so f4 never comes with tempo, which I have had played against me before in these types of positions over the board previously. And I'm also just preparing queen d6. And the problem with White's setup is that he's brought all of his pieces to the queen side and the center. But I have these monster bishops ready to open up. I even have ideas of lifting my rook over in some lines. And it's not easy at all. So here my opponent goes queen b1. He played this very quickly, clearly preparing the move pawn e4, because now the knight is not going to be pinned to the queen. But this is not a good move. It's not a good move. And in this position, I basically have 3 moves to choose between. I have queen d6, threatening checkmate. I have queen c7, not rook c7, queen c7, threatening checkmate. Or knight to e4, stopping white from playing pawn e4. Because if I play a lazy move like h6, then I was concerned about e4. And the engine actually isn't concerned whatsoever, because it thinks if takes and takes. Wait, what am I missing? Rook takes, bishop takes, queen takes. Oh, I have checkmate. I have back rank mate. I didn't even see that. I'm not going to lie. I didn't even see that concept. So I actually didn't have to be worried about pawn e4. So that's quite interesting. I went queen d6 though, threatening checkmate. And my opponent took about another 20 odd minutes here, and he got very low on time. I think he went down to about 20 minutes after I played queen d6. The engine does kind of like the move knight e4 in this position. The issue is after knight e4, de4, and the bishop moves to f1, if this bishop makes it to this diagonal, where is my advantage? I mean, sure, my e4 pawn is restrictive of the white position, but it also blocks my bishop, and I can, with the pawn on d5, right, with the pawn over on d5, I always have opportunities to sacrifice the pawn and open up this diagonal. But if the pawn is stuck on e4, I can never advance it. Engine thinks this is better for me, but I think I would have a hard time proving it, which is why I went queen to d6. Threatening checkmate in 1. Here, white has 2 moves. They should be relatively obvious. g3 or f4. And this is where my opponent spent about 20 minutes and got down to about 20 minutes remaining. I had about an hour remaining, I think. So I was doing very well on time. And remember, you only get additional time on move 35, and this is move 17. So I was like, well, my opponent's got just over a minute a move. There is no way he's going to be able to hold on to this. Now, I was anticipating the move g3 here. That is what I was anticipating. And to be honest, I wasn't entirely sure how I wanted to proceed. I was considering g6, stopping any bishop to f5, but I thought it's not that big a deal. I was considering h5, trying to advance up the board, and I thought, well, e4 is the natural counterattacking move, but I didn't think it worked because of de4, and if knight to e4, engine here likes knight e4, bishop e4, rook e4. No, that's a blunder. No, rook e4, and queen d5, threatening the rook and threatening checkmate if the rook moves, and if he defends the rook with the rook, I guess I take on d2, and if he defends with the pawn, then I have rook d8, pinning the bishop to the rook. I didn't see that, but I thought it would be interesting. I was also calculating the ideas of knight to h5, offering up the pawn on h7 to go king h8 and threaten takes. I thought that was really interesting. And it is actually winning if my opponent takes on h2. My issue with knight h5, though, was knight to e2, just defending, and this is just about equal for white. So I think my 2 real moves were either rook e5, trying to lift the rook over, which I hadn't fully calculated because I wanted to see what my opponent would do. But my only concern here was e4, trying to play bishop to f4, The engine says after d4, if bishop to f4, I guess I can play takes, takes, and takes, and have 2 pieces for a rook. And if the knight moves after d4, then I have knight takes e4. And if bishop to f4, queen d5, that's very complicated, I'm not going to lie. I thought if e4, I could potentially just move the rook, although I wasn't entirely sure about this position. The other move I was thinking of was the immediate knight to e4, and this is what I was going to play. This is what I was going to play, and I wasn't thrilled with this, but I thought, okay, knight e4 has to be played, otherwise I'm going to play takes, takes, and queen takes, and get 3 pawns for the piece, lift my rook, checkmate my opponent easily. So, for example, if, I don't even know what white plays here, let's say king g2, then I just take, and after takes, takes, here, I have mate in 5. I didn't calculate it until checkmate because there's no need, but the pieces are swarming. I probably don't even need my rook, to be fair. Yeah, this is just a classic checkmate pattern. So yeah, after g3, I was going to play knight to e4. I thought my opponent was forced to take, and after takes and bishop back to f1, here the engine likes pawn h5. I'm not sure I saw pawn h5, to be fair, although it is quite interesting. I was more so considering moving my queen to somewhere like g6 and preparing to push. Although after bishop c3, this is kind of equal. So I think this was the better line for my opponent to go for. I wonder why h5 is so much stronger. After bishop c3, queen e7... h4, g5. Okay, that's the idea. That's really interesting. If I found this, maybe I could go on to win, but it is quite difficult still. However, remember, my opponent is down to about 20 minutes, and he chooses pawn f4, which is actually the better move of the two. However, here, black has a really dangerous move, and my initial plan was to go knight to e4 here. I rejected this once my opponent played f4, because after knight e4, d-e4, I lose my access to the e3 pawn via the e-file, and after bishop to c4, let's say I move my queen to g6 to get off of this file, and bishop c3, I thought white was actually doing quite well here, because e3 might be weak, but this bishop's going to sit on d4. These bishops are pretty good, to be fair, and it's unclear how my bishops are actually doing anything, because they're blocked by the pawns on e4 and f4. So, I rejected knight e4. I can play moves like a6 or bishop c7, going for bishop b6 or bishop a7. That's the idea of a6, to go bishop to a7, I think. Yeah, that is. So after something like pawn a6, I mean, knight e2 is the move the engine wants to prepare bishop c3, and after something like bishop to a7, knight to d4, I thought this would be an interesting position. Same idea with bishop to c7, the knight comes back, I bring my bishop in, although this I was less enthralled with because of knight to b5, forcing me to take because of the fork. And here I wasn't really sure I could win this position. So I was kind of looking between pawn a6, and then I saw this move d4, which is the best move, and I played it. Why is d4 good? Well, one, we open up this bishop. Okay, makes sense. 2, where does this knight go? If this knight moves to a2 or e2, then I'm going to take on e3. So let's say knight to a2, for example, de3, and game over. Just game over. Bishop e3. And here, rook e3 is the best move. I can't say I saw rook e3. I was not considering rook e3. I just thought that with this bishop now opened up, I should be winning in a variety of ways. But let's play what the engine says. After rook e3, bishop h7 check, opening this up. Knight h7, rook d6, rook e1, queen e1, and bishop d6. I have 2 bishops and a rook for the queen, which is going to be completely winning, particularly with how good my bishops are and how weak the white king is. But basically, I thought, okay, if I take on e3, that's game over. And I don't even have to take. I could play something like knight d5 and just apply even more pressure to the position. And this looks pretty devastating. So, the main move, of course, is ed4. And I thought this was game over after queen takes d4. Now, what's interesting is white has one move that survives in this position. If you're feeling particularly, I don't know, intelligent, then try and find the move for white to hold this position. I had calculated king h1, and I thought that after queen f2 ideas... Now, the engine wants me to take on e1 first, but I thought queen f2, this should be winning. And it is. It is much better for black. The only move to hold on is knight to e4. Engine prefers taking on e1 first, and after rook e1, going rook to d8, and this is just actually a skewer. And if rook e3 defending, there is bishop to f4. Had this occurred on the board, I feel like I probably would have seen that. And if rook takes and bishop takes, I just take on f4 and deliver checkmate. So, yeah, I basically calculated king h1, queen f2, and I was like, well, there's no way for white to defend. The best case scenario is he loses the f4 pawn. And I mean, I'm going to bring my knight in, my bishop's very good, this bishop's very good, my rooks are good. I think I calculated bishop back to f1, rook e1, and if rook e1, then queen d2, and if bishop e1, then queen... Oh, I actually have queen f1 check. I didn't actually see that. I was calculating queen f4, and this is still completely winning. However, there is a defense. There is actually a defense. Bishop e3, which is a crazy move. And here, I only have one move that doesn't lose on the spot. If I take on e3, my opponent isn't going to take and allow me to take. He's going to go bishop h7 check, winning my queen. So my only move would be queen e3. And after rook e3, I have a rook and a bishop for the queen, but my bishops are just way too powerful, and the white position is crumbling. f4 is going to fall. This bishop is unopposed. My knight could hop in at any moment. I didn't mean to do that. Okay, thank you, chess.com. I don't know why you did that. But basically, I do have ways to go about it. Although after ed4, I don't have to take back. I can go like rook e1, and after something like rook e1, if queen takes, and I assume bishop e3 is still good, engine here is suggesting ideas of like g6, which is interesting. But after like queen d4, bishop e3, queen back to d6, I'm still doing quite well here, to be fair. My bishops are just very, very powerful. But after d4, we both of us thought that you can't take on d4. For the reasons that I just mentioned. The only way to survive is to find this bishop e3 move, which I think is very difficult. So my opponent played what I was expecting, knight b5. And this is where I had to calculate. Because, well, I had to calculate before I played d4. So when I played d4, I had to calculate the entire sequence you're about to see. So d4, knight b5, attacking my queen. Now here I've got to be careful, because if I play a move like queen d7 attacking the knight, then the knight just takes on d4. And white is up a pawn, and white is much better. So I have to play queen d5, only move, threatening checkmate and threatening to win the knight. White only has one move to respond, e4, which counterattacks my queen, stops checkmate, and means that I don't have time to take the knight. Well, with my bishop, obviously, because my queen hangs. I can't do it. So here, I again have one good move, which is queen back to d7. Again, threatening the knight. And here, white has two options. White either goes pawn e5, hitting my knight, or pawn a4, defending the knight and giving the knight an escape square. Now, I actually thought that e5 was losing during the game. Because after queen to d5, bishop back to f1, which is the only good defensive move. If rook e2, the game is over. After bishop b5, there is nothing. You can never take the knight because I take on e2, supported by the bishop. So after something like takes and takes, I am just up a piece. So rook e2 I thought was a blunder, which it is. So bishop f1 would be the only move, defending g2 and keeping an eye on the knight. And after bishop b5, queen e5, ef6. Here, gf6 is best, but even something like bishop to d6. And here, material is equal, but I have this very strong pawn on d4. and I thought I was doing rather well in this position, even though it is complicated. I was also considering the possibility of just not taking the knight and playing something like knight to h5 to make the position more complicated. Here, the only move is queen to d3. I assume if you play anything else, let's say a4 supporting the knight, then knight g3 ends the game because the bishop is under attack and I'm threatening g2 still. So after something like queen to d3, knight to f1, queen to f1 defending mate, I have something like pawn a6, kicking the knight away, and here I just thought bishop a4 should be sufficient for the win. Upper pawn, bishop pair, past d pawn should be pretty nice. So, as you can see, even though e5 is the best, well, I thought it was losing, but it is very, very complicated. My opponent actually played the best move, pawn to a4, although the engine changes its mind and says it's actually completely, well, not completely losing, but losing. And here I blitzed out the move a6. Clearly, it's the best move. If the knight moves to a3, which is its only escape square, I can take on a4, although I thought it was rather confusing after pawn to e5 counterattacking, because if bishop d1, something like rook to d1, and the knight moves, then h7 hangs, and I wasn't sure about this position. I wasn't sure. So, if knight back here, the engine likes g5, which is just insane. I was more so looking at moves like knight h5, trying to hop into the g3 square, apply pressure to f4, and make sure e5 doesn't come with tempo. After something like e5 anyway, pawn to g6, trying to cut off the diagonal. And here a5 is apparently the best move, but this is a very complicated position. Something like knight c4, game goes on, but I have an advantage here. My bishops are just really, really good. My knight is quite strong, and I feel like I have a lot of latent energy in this position where my pieces are just very well placed to cause damage if my opponent does something wrong. But after a4, a6, my opponent goes wrong. He goes e5. And here, black has one winning move. Should be able to find it. It is queen d5. Why is queen d5 the move? Well, we're threatening checkmate again, right? So our queen's done a bit of a dance. The queen has gone from d6 to d5, and then after e4 back to d7, and then back to d5. So we've done a bit of a dance, up, down, and up. The point is we're threatening checkmate. Okay, why is that relevant? Well, because bishop f1 is forced, which takes the bishop off of this diagonal, and then I can simply move the knight, and I don't have to worry about h7. And here, this knight will be forced to either come to d6, and I get to go up a pawn, which is great. White has the bishop pair, but it doesn't feel like enough to actually cause any damage. Or the knight goes back to a3, and I take on a4, and after something like rook c1, I'm just up a pawn again. So my opponent, I assume, saw that, and he played rook e2 rather quickly, and this is completely lost. Completely lost. Why? There is one move that wins for the black pieces. Can you find it? This is not a trick question. It's simply ab5. Simply ab5. Why? Why is ab5 winning? Well, I'm up a piece. Okay, yeah, Alex, but this is hanging. Yeah, but it's not. This pawn is pinned to the rook. So after ef6, I simply take on e2, and the game is over. You cannot take the rook because of mate in 1. That's why bishop f1 was the only move to defend. That's why. Because now you actually can take the knight. So if I take on b5, now you can take back, although it's better to take here first. And after something like bishop b5, queen b5, ef6, I am up a pawn after gf6, but this is obviously a better position for white to try to play. It's still better for me, and I feel like I should be able to convert this with the passed d pawn and the weak pawns on f4 and b2, but obviously this is better. The problem with rook e2 is the ab5, ef6, rook e2. My opponent tries bishop h7 check, and here I did actually take a minute because I was like, well, if king f8, then like, I don't know, bishop b4 could be slightly annoying. And my king has to come to e8. I'm still fine, but simply king to h8. And my opponent takes on g7. I of course have to take back. And he resigns because I'm threatening mate. I'm up a rook, and there's no way to stop checkmate. So I thought this was a really, really interesting game. I played at, what was the accuracy? Like 98.5, was it? Let me see. Yeah, 98.5% accuracy with a quote-unquote brilliant move with queen to d5, sacrificing the knight, although it's obviously just mate in one, so hardly a sacrifice. But yeah, really, really happy with that game. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you want to see my previous over-the-board classical game, check out the video up here. And my entire playlist of over-the-board games is down there if you're interested. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video.